I saw the email 3 weeks after they sent it, and by then, my daughter had already decided what my life was going to look like. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, I'm 74 years old, and I spent most of my life believing that trust was something you earned slowly and never questioned once it was given, especially not with your own child. Especially not with the only daughter you raised after burying your husband and rebuilding everything from scratch in a quiet Massachusetts town where people still wave from their porches and remember your name at the grocery store, and for years. Charlotte handled things for me. Small things at first, like paying utility bills online or setting up automatic deposits, then bigger things like managing my accounts, talking to the bank, even speaking to my attorney on my behalf when I said I didn't feel like driving into the city anymore. And I let her, because that's what good mothers do when their children offer to help. They step back a little, they tell themselves this is what it means to grow older with dignity, to let the next generation carry the weight, and I remember the exact morning everything shifted. It was a Tuesday, just after 9 a.m. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, the sunlight coming through the window just like it always had for the past 40 years. And I opened my laptop to check something simple, a recipe my neighbor had emailed me. Nothing important, nothing urgent, just routine, and that's when I saw it. Buried halfway down my inbox, a subject line that didn't look threatening, didn't look dramatic, just 6 words that didn't belong there, not in my email, not in my life, not in any version of the future I thought I had left, and for a moment, I didn't even click it, I just stared at it. Because something in my chest tightened in a way that didn't feel like fear, it felt like recognition, like my body understood something my mind wasn't ready to accept yet, and when I finally opened it, I didn't gasp, I didn't cry, I didn't even move. I just read, slowly, line by line, every word settling into place like pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I'd been solving. And the strangest part was not what it said, it was what it assumed, the quiet certainty behind it, the casual tone, the way my name appeared not as a person, but as a problem to be managed, a detail to be handled, something temporary. Something that wouldn't require explanation because, as they had written so plainly, I would never check, and I sat there in that same chair for a long time, longer than I care to admit, holding onto the edge of the table as if it might steady something inside me. That had just shifted beyond repair, and by the time I closed the laptop, I already knew 2 things with absolute clarity. The first was that my daughter had been planning something without me, and the second was that whatever she thought she understood about me, about what I would notice, about what I would ignore, she was about to learn how wrong she had been. By that afternoon, nothing in my house had changed, but everything felt different, like the walls had quietly shifted a few inches overnight, and I was the only one who could see it, and I moved through my kitchen slowly, deliberately, rinsing my coffee cup, wiping down the counter, doing all the small, ordinary things that had always grounded me, because I knew if I rushed, if I reacted too quickly, I would miss something important, and missing something was exactly what they were counting on. So I did not call Charlotte, I did not forward the email, I did not even mark it as unread, I simply left it there, sitting in my inbox like a truth waiting patiently to be acknowledged, and instead, I opened a different tab, one I had not used in months. My bank account, and for a moment I hesitated, not because I was afraid of what I would find, but because some part of me still wanted to believe that the email was a misunderstanding, a mistake, something taken out of context, but belief has a way of disappearing the moment facts begin to line up, and that morning, they lined up quickly, transaction by transaction, small transfers at first, amounts that would not raise suspicion, $200 here, $500 there. Labeled in ways that looked routine, maintenance, adjustments, internal movements, but when I expanded the history and traced them back, I saw a pattern, a quiet, careful pattern that had been building for months, and I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, breathing slowly, because anger would not help me here, and neither would panic. What I needed was clarity, and clarity comes from patience, so I kept reading, opening statements, checking dates, comparing names, and that was when I saw his name appear more than once, Daniel Price, my son-in-law, not as a casual Mention, not as a family contact, but tied directly to accounts I did not remember authorizing, accounts that were now somehow connected to mine, and I felt something settle inside me then. Not shock, not even betrayal. Just a quiet understanding that this had not been impulsive, this had been planned, discussed, agreed upon, and executed with the kind of confidence that only comes when you are certain no one is watching, and I thought back to the email again, the tone of it. The certainty, the assumption that I would never check, and I realized that the email had not been the beginning of anything, it had been the confirmation of something already in motion, something they believed was already secure, and that was when I closed my laptop. Not because I was finished, but because I had seen enough for that moment, enough to know that this was not a conversation I was going to have over the phone, not a misunderstanding I was going to clear up with a simple question. This required something else, something quieter, something more precise, and as I stood up from the table and walked toward the hallway where I kept an old folder with documents I had not touched in years, I understood exactly why they felt so comfortable making decisions without me, because I had spent years showing them that I trusted them completely, and now, for the first time, I was going to show them what it meant when I stopped. There was a time when I would have defended Charlotte without hesitation, when anyone who questioned her intentions would have been met with a polite but firm correction, because I knew my daughter, or at least I believed I did. And I remember the years after her father passed, how quiet the house became, how every decision felt heavier without someone to share it with, and how Charlotte stepped into that silence with a kind of determination that made me proud. She worked hard, built a life, married a man who seemed stable, responsible. Someone who spoke confidently about investments and long-term planning, and when they offered to help me manage things, it did not feel like control. It felt like care, like a natural progression of roles, the child becoming the protector. The parent finally allowed to rest, and I accepted that shift slowly, piece by piece, first by letting Charlotte sit in on a meeting with my attorney, then by adding her name to a joint account for convenience, then by signing documents I skimmed instead of studied because she was standing beside me, explaining everything in a calm, reassuring voice, and I trusted that voice because it belonged to my daughter, and trust, once given, has a way of becoming invisible. You stop noticing it, you stop questioning it, you stop verifying the details because you believe the relationship itself is the proof, and looking back now, I can see the small moments I dismissed, the way Daniel would answer questions directed at Charlotte, the way certain financial conversations would pause when I entered the room and resume once I left, the way paperwork began to move faster than I could comfortably follow, always framed as efficiency, always presented as something that would make my life easier. And I told myself that I was lucky, that not everyone had children willing to step in like this, that not everyone had support, and I held on to that belief even when something in me hesitated. Even when I felt that quiet discomfort that I could not quite explain, because acknowledging it would have meant questioning them, and questioning them would have meant admitting that I might not be as secure as I thought I was. And that is a difficult thing to face after a lifetime of building stability. So I chose comfort over curiosity, I chose trust over verification, and for a long time, that choice felt justified. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing obvious went wrong. Everything appeared to function smoothly, and that is what made it so effective, because the absence of conflict does not mean the absence of intent. It simply means the plan has not reached its visible stage yet, and as I stood there in the hallway holding that old folder, running my fingers along documents that had not been touched in years, I realized that the foundation I believed was solid had been quietly adjusted over time, not in a way that would alarm me, but in a way that would eventually leave me with very little control, and the most unsettling part was not that they had made changes, it was that they had done so with complete confidence that I would never notice, that I would never look closely enough, that I would continue being exactly who they needed me to be. Trusting, accommodating, and just unaware enough to make everything easy for them. That folder had not been opened since the year my husband passed, and even then I had only touched it because the attorney insisted I keep everything organized in one place. Deeds, account summaries, the original trust documents. Copies of signatures that once felt like formalities rather than safeguards, and as I carried it back to the kitchen table, I noticed how heavy it felt in my hands, not physically, but in a way that reminded me these were not just papers, they were decisions. And decisions have consequences long after the ink dries, and I sat down slowly, placing the folder beside my laptop, not opening it right away, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. That rushing through documents is exactly how you lose control of them, and for years, I had been rushing, not out of carelessness, but out of trust, and that trust had been quietly used as permission, so this time, I did the opposite. I took my time. I opened the folder carefully, one section at a time, reading each page fully, not skimming, not assuming, just reading, and it did not take long before I noticed the differences, subtle changes in language, amendments that had been added, authorizations expanded. Names included where they had not originally been, and there it was again, Daniel's name, appearing not as a secondary contact, but as someone with increasing access, increasing authority, and I paused there, holding the page in my hand, because I remembered signing something like this. I remembered Charlotte explaining it to me, telling me it was just a formality to make things easier in case of emergencies, and I had nodded, because emergencies make everything sound urgent, and urgency makes questions feel unnecessary. But now, looking at it without her voice guiding me, the language felt different, more permanent, more deliberate, and I realized that what had been presented as convenience had slowly become control, and I turned to another section, the property documents, the house that I had lived in for over 40 years, the same house where Charlotte grew up, where birthdays were celebrated, where holidays filled every room with noise and warmth, and I traced the lines of ownership, the percentages, the clauses, and there was a revision date I did not fully remember, a modification that shifted future decisions in a way that would allow changes to be made without my direct involvement under certain conditions. Conditions that sounded reasonable when read quickly, but now felt dangerously open when read carefully, and I leaned back again, closing the folder halfway, not out of confusion, but out of clarity, because this was no longer about a single email or a few transactions. This was a structure, something built slowly over time, piece by piece, with my cooperation, with my signatures, with my trust, and the most unsettling part was how ordinary it all looked, how nothing on the surface appeared dramatic or illegal, just adjustments, updates, standard procedures, the kind of things families do when they believe they are planning for the future. Except this future had been planned without me, for me, in a way that assumed I would never step in to question it, and I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, the clock ticking on the wall, the same sound it had made every day for years. And I understood that whatever I did next had to be just as deliberate as what they had done, not louder, not faster, just more precise, because if they believed I would never check, then the only advantage I had left was that I already had. That evening, Charlotte called like she always did on Tuesdays, her voice warm, casual, as if nothing in the world had shifted, as if I were still exactly where she expected me to be, and I answered on the second ring, not too quickly, not too slowly. Because timing matters when you are being watched, even if the watching is only assumed, and she asked the usual questions, how are you feeling? Did you eat? Do you need anything from the store? And I responded the way I always had, steady, appreciative, predictable, because there is a certain kind of power in being exactly who people think you are, especially when they have already decided you will never change, and I listened more than I spoke, paying attention not just to her words, but to the spaces between them, the small hesitations, the way she redirected the conversation whenever it drifted toward anything related to finances or paperwork, and at one point, she mentioned Daniel was working late, something about a meeting. Something about finalizing details, and I did not ask what details, I did not ask which meeting, because questions alert people, and I was not ready to alert anyone yet, so instead, I said something simple. Something that fit the version of me she believed in. I said I was thinking about organizing some old documents, maybe clearing out things I no longer needed, and there was a brief pause on the line, just a second. Barely noticeable if you were not listening for it, but I was, and then she Responded quickly, almost too quickly, telling me not to worry about that, telling me she and Daniel would handle anything important, that I should just relax, enjoy my time. And that was when I knew with absolute certainty that the control I had seen on paper was not theoretical, it was active, it was being protected, and I ended the call shortly after, not abruptly, just naturally, the way I always did. Because routine is the easiest disguise, and once the line went quiet, I set the phone down and sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle, not feeling anger, not feeling sadness, just a kind of stillness that comes when decisions begin to form, and I turned back to my laptop, reopening the email, reading it again, this time more slowly, paying attention to every word, every assumption, every detail that might reveal more than it intended, and I noticed something I had missed before, a reference to a timeline. A date mentioned casually, as if it were already agreed upon, and I cross-checked that date with the documents in front of me, with the transaction history, with the revisions in the folder, and everything aligned in a way that was too precise to be accidental. And I realized then that whatever they were planning was not months away. It was approaching, quietly, confidently, under the assumption that I would continue doing exactly what I had always done, nothing, and I closed the laptop again. Not out of uncertainty, but because I had reached the point where observation alone was no longer enough, and I stood up, walked to the small desk in the corner of the room, and pulled out a notepad I had not used in years, and for the first time since opening that email, I began to write, not questions, not accusations, just a list of steps, deliberate, measured, each one leading to the next, because if they had built this plan slowly over time, then I would dismantle it the same way, quietly, carefully, and without giving them a single reason to suspect that anything had changed until it was already too late. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind was too clear, and clarity has a way of keeping you awake when everything you once trusted begins to rearrange itself into something more precise, and by 6 in the morning, I was already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with my notepad in front of me, the list from the night before now expanded into something more structured, more intentional, and the first step was simple: I needed to confirm everything without interference, so I picked up the phone and called the bank directly, not the number Charlotte had saved for me, not the contact she usually handled, but the official line printed on my statement, and when the representative answered, I introduced myself calmly, provided my information, and requested a full review of my accounts, all linked accounts, all authorized users, every detail, and there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that happens when a request is not unusual, but not routine either, and then the representative complied, walking me through each account, each authorization, each connection, and as I listened, I took notes, not reacting, not interrupting, just documenting, because confirmation is not about emotion, it is about accuracy, and everything I had seen the day before was there. Verified, expanded even, additional authorizations, extended access levels, permissions that allowed decisions to be made under certain conditions, conditions that sounded reasonable when described in isolation, but together created something far more concerning, and when I asked who had initiated these changes, the answer was exactly what I expected. They had been processed through authorized channels, properly signed, properly submitted. Everything appearing legitimate on the surface, and that was the problem. Legitimacy can be constructed when trust is used as a foundation, and I thanked the representative, ended the call, and sat there for a moment, letting the confirmation settle into place, because now there was no uncertainty left. Only action, and the next step required someone who understood the structure better than I did, someone who had seen situations like this before. So I reached for a number I had not dialed in years, Victor Hale, my attorney, the same man who had helped me organize everything after my husband passed, and when he answered, his voice was steady, familiar, unchanged, and I told him I needed to see him in person, not next week, not when it was convenient, but today, and there was a pause. Shorter than I expected, and then he agreed without asking too many questions, which told me he understood the tone in my voice, the kind that does not come from confusion, but from realization, and by 10:30 that morning, I was sitting across from him. In his office, the folder open between us, the printed email placed carefully on top, and for the first time since this began, I spoke plainly. I did not soften it. I did not protect anyone's intentions. I simply explained what I had found, what I had confirmed, and what I needed to do next, and he listened without interrupting, reviewing each document, each note, each detail with the kind of focus that comes from experience, and when he finally looked up at me, his expression had changed, not surprised, not shocked, just resolved, and he said something that settled everything into place. He said, "Eleanor, this can be corrected, but we have to move carefully," and I nodded, because careful was exactly what I had planned from the beginning. Victor did not rush me, and that was the first thing I appreciated, because rushing is how mistakes are made, and mistakes were exactly what Charlotte and Daniel were counting on. So instead, he laid everything out in front of us. Not just the documents I had brought, but the structure behind them, the legal pathways that had been quietly expanded over time, and he explained it in a way that was simple, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. They had not taken anything outright, not yet, but they had positioned themselves so that when the moment came, they would not need my permission, only my absence, and that word settled in my mind more heavily than anything else, absence, because it meant their plan did not rely on confrontation. It relied on me staying exactly as I had been, trusting, passive, and just uninvolved enough to make their next move appear seamless, and I asked him one question, not about what they had done, but about what I could still control, and his answer was immediate, more than you think, but only if we act before they do, and that was when the plan shifted from understanding to action, and we began with the most important piece, authority, every authorization that had been granted. Every access point that allowed decisions to be made without me needed to be reviewed, restricted, or revoked entirely, and he drafted the documents while I sat across from him, reading each line carefully, this time without anyone guiding me, without anyone summarizing, just me and the language as it was written, and when I signed, I knew exactly what I was agreeing to, not because I trusted someone else to explain it, but because I had taken the time to understand it myself, and from there, we moved to the accounts. Instructions were prepared to limit access, to require direct verification for any future transactions, to remove any assumptions of shared control that had been quietly established, and then came the house. The one thing I knew they believed was already within reach, and Victor was very clear about this. The structure could be changed. Ownership could be secured in a way that required my explicit involvement for any future decision. But timing mattered. Everything we did needed to happen without drawing attention, without triggering any alerts that might cause them to accelerate their plan, and I agreed, because silence had been their advantage. And now it would be mine, and by the time we finished, the folder in front of me looked the same on the outside, but everything inside it had been adjusted, corrected, and realigned in a way that restored something I had not realized I had lost: control. And as I stood to leave, Victor handed me a final copy of everything we had prepared, neatly organized, precise, complete, and he said something I will not forget: "They believe you are not paying attention." And I met his eyes and answered without hesitation, "Let them keep believing that," because for the first time since I opened that email, I understood exactly how this was going to end. Not with an argument, not with a confrontation, but with a moment. One moment where everything they thought was already theirs would no longer be. They chose the timing themselves, which made everything easier, because people reveal the most when they believe the outcome is already secured, and Charlotte called 2 days later with a brightness in her voice that felt rehearsed, asking if I could meet them at Victor's office that Friday morning, saying there were just a few final documents to go over, nothing complicated, nothing I needed to worry about, and I agreed without hesitation, because hesitation creates suspicion, and suspicion was the one thing I could not afford. So Friday came quietly, the kind of clear Massachusetts morning where the air feels still and everything appears ordinary, and I arrived 10 minutes early, just like I always had, sitting in the waiting area with my hands folded in my lap. the same calm posture I had carried for years, and when Charlotte and Daniel walked in, they smiled the way they always did, warm, confident, already at ease, as if this meeting was simply the final step in something they had long considered settled, and Charlotte kissed my cheek, asking if I had brought the folder, and I nodded, holding it gently in my hands, because presentation matters, even in silence, and we moved into the conference room together, Victor already seated at the table, his briefcase open, documents arranged neatly in front of him, and for a moment, everything looked exactly as it should. 3 signatures away from completion, one more formality before everything shifted permanently, and Daniel began speaking first, explaining the documents in a smooth, practiced tone, referring to adjustments, efficiencies, future planning, all the same. Language that had been used before, language designed to sound helpful while moving control further away from me, and Charlotte watched me carefully, not openly, but in small glances, measuring my reactions, expecting the same quiet agreement she had always received, and I listened, just as I had done before, nodding at the right moments, letting them finish without interruption, because interruption breaks rhythm, and I needed their rhythm intact. And when Daniel finally slid the documents toward me, placing a pen beside them, there was a brief pause, the kind that signals expectation, the moment where everything is supposed to proceed exactly as planned, and I reached for the folder instead, not the pen, opening it slowly, placing the printed email on the table between us, smoothing it flat with my hand, and for the first time since this began, I spoke directly, not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly. You said I would never check, and the room went quiet in a way that felt immediate and complete, Charlotte's expression shifting before she could stop it, Daniel leaning back slightly, his confidence interrupted, and Victor did not move, because he already knew what was coming next. And I continued without raising my voice. I did check, and I brought everything with me, and then I turned the page, sliding the revised documents across the table, the ones they had not prepared for, the ones that changed everything they thought was already decided. And I watched as understanding replaced assumption in their eyes, not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, the same way their plan had been built, and in that moment, there was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet realization that what they believed was already theirs had never actually left my hands at all. No one spoke for several seconds, and in that silence, everything they had built between assumption and certainty began to fall apart without a single word needing to be said, and Charlotte was the first to react, her voice softer than I had ever heard it, asking what this was, what I meant, as if confusion might give her time to recover, but confusion only works when the other person is unsure, and I was not unsure anymore, so I answered her simply, "These are the documents that now govern everything you thought you controlled." And I watched as Daniel reached for the pages, his movements slower than before, the confidence in his posture replaced by calculation, reading quickly at first, then more carefully. Because the details mattered now in a way they had not before, and Victor spoke then, not to explain, but to confirm, outlining the changes in clear, measured terms, authority revoked, access restricted, ownership secured in a structure that required my direct approval for any future decision. Every pathway they had relied on quietly closed without warning, and Charlotte's expression shifted again, not into anger, not yet, but into something closer to realization. The kind that arrives when someone understands that the outcome they had planned for no longer exists, and she looked at me differently then, not as someone to guide, not as someone to manage, but as someone she had misjudged entirely. And I did not raise my voice, I did not list grievances, I did not ask for explanations, because this was not about proving what they had done, it was about establishing what would happen next, and I said exactly what needed to be said, nothing more, nothing less. I trusted you with everything because you were my daughter, and I stopped there, letting the weight of that sentence stand on its own, because it did not need embellishment, and then I added, I will not continue that mistake, and that was the moment everything settled, not dramatically, not loudly, but definitively. The conversation shifted from assumption to consequence, from control to limitation, and Charlotte tried to speak again, something about misunderstanding, about intentions, about how they were only trying to help, but those explanations no longer held any weight, because help does not require secrecy. And care does not depend on someone never checking, and I gathered my folder slowly, placing each document back in order, closing it with the same calm precision I had carried from the beginning, and I stood up without waiting for agreement, without waiting for acknowledgement, because neither was necessary anymore, and as I walked toward the door, I felt something I had not felt in a long time, not relief,